I was asked to speak on the Global Charter of Conscience. This was published in Brussels last June, spearheaded by the Evangelical Alliance in Europe. If you think 2015 will be the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, and you can see since Magna Carta in 1215, there's been a growing progression of great statements on freedom, human rights, including religious freedom. The climax, of course, was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But Article 18, which covers religious freedom, is probably the most contested and the most neglected. So this Global Charter of Conscience, I was one of the drafters. It's gone through about 60 different legal experts and things like that. And it was supported by a fair number of the different faiths in Brussels. It has some very simple aims. First, to celebrate and reaffirm Article 18 of the Universal Declaration. Secondly, to launch a new discussion of the importance of religious freedom. Because all over the Western world, in America, as well as in Europe, where religion is disdained, religious freedom is discounted. And you can see today that religious freedom is in a bad shape in much of the world. But thirdly, the idea is to challenge Europe and the United States to rediscover their heritage, because these are European ideas, rediscover their heritage and stand clearly in the world. Because at the moment, while many of the problems are elsewhere in the world, as I'll say later, we are responding in Europe and America with confusion, uncertain of who we are, uncertain about how we behave, so that, for example, when the immigrants come, Muslim or whatever, we're giving them very mixed signals. So the challenge is for Europe and America to regain its leadership on this tremendous issue. And I hope that Christians will too. More of that in a minute. Let me go on, though, to give some of the sort of background today of the challenge of religious freedom. Now, I know as journalists, your number one concern is freedom of speech, freedom of expression. But I will argue that they're linked, and we've got to, certainly as Christians, argue first and foremost for freedom of conscience and religion and belief. But some very, very quick background thoughts, and then throw it open for you to discussion. Let me try and give you an overview of the state of the union, as it were, on this issue of religious freedom today. Some very simple points. First, there are three sources of the problem. I'm going to go with these lightning ways. Three sources of the problem. First, government oppression. Think of the governments of the world oppressing their people. China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., etc., etc. That is a major source of the problem. Second source, sectarian violence. Think of India and the Hindu nationalists. Think of Nigeria and Boko Haram persecuting Christians. Think of Burma and all the prejudice against the Rohingya Muslims and so on. Sectarian violence, conflict. The third source of the problem comes closer to home, are Western confusions. You can see in many, many ways across the West that we do not know who we are and how we behave, put it in Muslim terms, in our tent. So these millions of immigrants coming from all around the world, and we're responding in ways that are rather clueless. So you look, say, England, Netherlands, they were tolerant countries. So when the immigrants came in the 1970s, what was the tolerant way? It was state multiculturalism. So bring them in and stress multiculturalism, let them grow their own communities, etc. What do? We bred the murderers of Theo Van Gogh. We, in England, bred the bombers who blew up the underground. And you can see that our disastrous multiculturalism was the problem. The French, of course, had a different way, and they have different problems. But you can see in America, where they've had 50 years now of culture warring over religion and other issues like this, the Western world is marked by confusion and controversy over how to handle this. So you've got government oppression, you've got sectarian violence, and you've got Western confusions. The world does not handle it. Second point, think of the paradoxical position that we have as Christians on this issue. Again, 3 quick points. First, we are the world pioneers of religious freedom. Did you know where it came from? The first ever mention of religious freedom is the North African theologian and apologist Tertullian. And he talks about religious liberty, using the Latin word. That's the first mention. I don't know if you know the second mention publicly. It was from another Christian apologist, Lactantius. And why that's important, have you ever heard of the Edict of Milan? Many people think that the Edict of Milan by the Emperor Constantine made Rome Christian. Not so. It was Theodosius in 380s who made Rome Christian. But Constantine published what really is the first edict of religious tolerance in history. But the key thing is, how did he do it? His son's tutor, his son's schoolteacher, was a Christian apologist, Lactantius, who taught him the teaching of religious liberty. No one should be coerced to believe. And that's there in the Edict of Milan. So we are the great pioneers. Modern religious freedom comes in the 17th century, I'm proud to say, from England. It did not come from the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Salons, good food, good wine, good conversations. That's the myth of the Enlightenment. No, it came in the 17th century from Christian believers who were terribly distressed at the wars of religion. And over against that, they formulated religious freedom. The greatest of them all was Roger Williams, the first man to argue for freedom of conscience for people of all faiths. So even great philosophers like John Locke, he argued for toleration, but he didn't include atheists, and he didn't include Catholics. Whereas Roger Williams argued everybody, and he said Mohammedan infidels, which is his word for atheists, and so on. He argued that everyone should have freedom of conscience. So the point is, we are the pioneers. But part of the paradox, secondly, we are the chief violators. Thank God, not evangelicals. We have no blood on our hands as evangelicals, thank God. But if you think the Catholic Church, notions like error has no rights, or the Inquisition, or the forced conversion of the Jews, or whatever it is, we have in the background of the church horrendous evils that are a terrible violation of religious freedom. So we're the pioneers, and we also have in our record the worst violations. So people remember that when they see us talking today. Now, the third part of the paradox is in today's world, we are the most persecuted faith on the world. So if you look everywhere in the world, 70% of the world does not have religious freedom. Now, lots of people are persecuted here, there, or ever. Muslims in China, Baha'i in Iran. You can go around the place and find places where certain people are really picked out. But only one faith is persecuted pretty well everywhere, where everyone's persecuted, and that is the Christian faith. So when we speak out of this issue, people have a mixed response. We are the pioneers, they often don't know that. We have been in the past, think the Catholic Church, think the Orthodox Church, the worst violators, and we are around the world the most persecuted, so people think we're only concerned for our own skins and only stand up for our own people. Thirdly, let's go on to a much more important point. Why is this issue important today? The burning world issue is how do we live with our deep differences? And there's no answer to this without solving the problem of religious freedom for everybody. Now, why has that issue become important? Well, first, there's an explosion of diversity, including religion, media, travel, migration. The world is on the march as never before, and it's now said everyone is now everywhere. So it's not just little private religions at home, but entire worldviews, entire ways of life, elbow to elbow, with other entire worldviews and ways of life in the same society. When my wife grew up in Los Angeles, you have public schools with 90 religions, 90 religions in one school. How do you work out how you live with differences? It is a world explosive problem. Secondly, it's important because you can see that the old ways of settling it are breaking down. Now, some of the old ways are not that old, comparatively recent, but they've shaped our countries for several hundred years. You take, say, the French. The great year for the French was 1789. And you remember, before the Revolution, you had a corrupt church, a corrupt state. They were both in collusion and both oppressive. So what did the French do? They threw off both the king and the church, the throne and the altar, as they said. So in France, then and now, if you're in favor of faith, you're reactionary. If you're in favor of freedom, you're an atheist and secularist. And that's what the French call laïcité. And of course, that system, which is their system, is now butting heads furiously with the Muslim immigrants and with others in ways that are completely unjust and unworkable and will have to be adapted. Now, the French were followed by Kemal Ataturk when the Ottoman Empire went out of existence. And so, as you know, Turkish life has been secular at the national level. They're having many of the same problems, but of course Islam is stronger in Turkey than it is in France. And so you can see the Prime Minister Erdogan getting in, Turkey swinging from a very secular government to a more and more Islamist government. You can see in England, our big year was 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution. We kept a state church in order not to be Catholic, because that was the French way and they were the enemy. But the state church was not oppressive, hasn't slaughtered or killed anyone like the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France. So it was a state church, and there was a sort of mild reaction over 300 years. Today, the Church of England is very weak, theologically, spiritually, culturally, politically, very, very weak. The cynics in England say it's only fit for, I don't know if you translate this into your languages, the hatching, matching, and dispatching of citizens. In other words, you baptize them, you marry them, you bury them, that's it. Not much use for anything else. It's still there, but hardly. And you have a growing power of secularism and the growing power of Islam. You can see in Scandinavia, the Swedes have a state church like that. And in 2000, they got rid of it. And they're swinging from the state church of Lutheranism over to an increasingly secular society. Even America, their big year was 1791. And the genius of America was they disestablished the church. And people say, well, religion's flourished in America. Yes, it's flourished, because when they disestablished the church, faith was made voluntary, according to the dictates of each individual, and then of course it flourished. It didn't need the state or anything like that behind it. The sword of the state or the purse of the state didn't need it. It has flourished magnificently, but that was then. For 50 years, America has had increasing culture wars over many things, including religion, and today America's in a huge mess. In other words, all the traditional settlements in the West are under pressure because of the exploding diversity, and we need to renegotiate them in the light of the modern world. The last point I'll make in this is, we're seeing the emergence, and this touches the world that many of you into, the internet, we're seeing the emergence of a global public square. Where did the public square come from? The idea, it goes back to the Greeks. You've been to Athens, you've seen the agora. It wasn't the marketplace, it was the civic center where citizens came together to debate the issues of common public life. It was a physical place. The Romans had the Forum. In England we have Westminster. The French have the Assemblée. The Americans, the US Congress. A physical place. But then it became a metaphor. So, wherever issues of public life were debated, could be in the newspaper, could be in a television show, that was metaphorically the public square. But now we've changed again from the physical to the metaphorical to the virtual. And if you think of the lessons, say, of the responses to the Pope's speech, and not the Pope's speech to Regensburg, or earlier still, the Danish cartoons, or a little video in America, wretched little video, The Innocence of Muslims. Now, even when we're not speaking to the world, because of the internet, we can be heard by the world, and the world can organize its response. So we're seeing the emergence of a global public square, and the first efforts are not promising. You look at something like the blogs. As soon as you have anonymous screen names, you can see the level of debate and discourse goes down, and people are barbaric and hateful and vicious, etc., etc., etc. And the challenge is, how do we live with our deep differences in this emerging global public square that's created by the internet and the social media touching your world? Let me hurry on. We have to choose which model we think best for religion and public life. The Bible doesn't give us an answer. The Bible doesn't give us a retirement plan. It doesn't give us an economic system. It doesn't give us lots of things, but we have principles to work out in our time what's the most just, most human, most free way of doing things. Now, if you look at the world, at the moment there are two extremes in terms of models. One model is what's called the sacred public square. In other words, one religion dominates. Might be a monopoly, or it might be just stronger than the others, but it dominates, established or whatever. And you have mild versions of that. I mentioned the Church of England. It's about as weak and mild as you can get, sadly. Think of very strong. What's a strong version of the sacred public square? Yes, but which? Absolutely. Iran, Saudi Arabia, any minority in those countries, take the Baha'i in Iran or anyone in Saudi Arabia, including Christians, they're in trouble. The sacred public square, as it gets stronger in its doesn't allow religious freedom for everyone. Often it's highly oppressive and extremely unjust, and that is the wrong solution. But the world is working away from monopolies. The other extreme is what's called the naked public square, where all religion is cleaned out. Now, of course, secularism gets in the back door. But since most of the world is religious, that's very unfair too. Now, what are examples of that? Biggest of them all? China, obviously. So you can see there with a sacred public square or a naked public square, you do not have freedom for everybody. The new vision of the alternative, which is behind this, the Global Charter, is what's called a civil public square. That's a public square where everybody, based on freedom of conscience, has the right to enter public life and engage public life from their own faith position. They're free to be faithful. But within a framework of understanding, which is political, of what is just and free for everybody else too. So a right for us as Christians is automatically a right for Jews, a right for Muslims, a right for Hindus, a right for Mormons, a right for atheists. A right for one person is a right for another person and a responsibility for all. so that we're free to enter and engage, and we respect the rights of others and know how to deal with them and negotiate the differences peacefully and civilly. Now, that notion is often misunderstood. Some people see it as a search for a lowest common denominator unity, as if we love everyone, we'll all agree. And after all, as some people say, underlying all the religions, basically we're all one. That is nonsense. As you know, just looking at them, the differences between the religions are ultimate and irreducible. There will never be a religious unity. The civil public square allows people to be free to what makes them different, to be free to be faithful to what they believe, and yet to know how to deal with other people peacefully and persuasively. And one could go on. Now, are we utopian? Do you think that just publishing something like this, the world's going to be peaceful in 2 minutes? Of course not. If you look, say, at human rights, there are 3 stages by which they become practical. And this becomes very important for Europe. Stage 1 is declaration. The Universal Declaration is only a set of principles. Nothing legally binding at all. If they waited for that, they would never have done it. When it passed in 1948, it is a set of principles, ringing principles. It's been described as the Bible of human rights. The second step is what's called implementation, when the principles are enshrined in constitutions and laws and articles. And that's very, very important. But, and here's the problem in Europe, many people forget the third stage, declaration, principles only. Implementation, enshrined in law. The third stage is education and transmission. C.S. Lewis talks about having trained emotions. Tocqueville, the great French commentator, called it the habits of the heart. It's when notions like religious freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech become a habit of the heart. They're taught by parents to children, teachers to school children. They become a habit. They're sort of ingrained. Then they flourish. Now, if you think that's the problem with Europe, Europe has got laws coming out of its teeth. We've got laws for everything. But the gap in Europe between all these highfalutin laws and ordinary people is extreme. And on the ground, hardly anyone understands religious freedom. And that gap means that Europe, while it prides itself in being a leader to the world, is simply not. And we've got enormous confusion here because we haven't moved from the implementation of laws to the education and transmission of these things so that they're the habit of the heart of European citizens and they really know how to behave. Now, I don't for a minute believe that you have a solution that's one size fits everyone. Every country has its own history. Every country has its own values. But whatever the country is and the settlement that it chooses, I think we as Christians would fight for the fact that at the core of that settlement should be a really firm establishment of the rights of freedom of conscience for everybody. And that this should spread slowly, whatever the settlement is. And to the degree that it spreads properly, to that degree we can say that a country is truly just and free. Now I've left at last the most important point. Why religious freedom? Obviously it's not as important as the gospel. Christians have been persecuted. Millions of Christians have been and are being martyred. So it's not a doctrine of the faith that we fight for like the gospel. But why is it important as a matter of public life? 3 reasons, and you think of this because we've got to argue for these things in the public square today. First, religious freedom is the first freedom. If you take the 3 basic human rights, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech or expression, or freedom of assembly or association. Obviously, as journalists, yours is number 2, freedom of speech. But as believers, number one. Now, they are all interlocking. There's no hierarchy. But if you think they're interdependent, freedom of assembly, getting together with people, the right to, assumes and requires freedom of speech. Why do you want to get together? Just to have a big hug-in? No. You want to get together to be able to be free to say things that matter to you, to the people you want to get together with. Now, equally, freedom of speech assumes and requires freedom of conscience. What do you want to say when you get together? You want to say things, you can talk about the weather, you're free to talk about the weather. In England, our weather changes so much and so miserable. We're always moaning about the weather. We're free to, but that's irrelevant. You want to be free to talk about the things that matter to you because you're convinced of them based on the dictates of conscience. Martin Luther, here I stand, so help me God, I can do no other. That's dictates of conscience. So freedom of conscience is the first liberty, and we need to argue that. Our secular friends, they say freedom of conscience, it's religious liberty, it's liberty for the religious, and we're not. No. Freedom of conscience is freedom of religion, thought, and belief. It includes atheists. That's a worldview too. But it is the first liberty. Secondly, very important again in today's discussion, freedom of conscience is the key to civil society. I don't know if you've discussed that. People say societies are civil and they have social capital, as it's put today, if between ordinary citizens at the bottom and the government and the state at the top, there is a thick layering of organizations in which people can volunteer and participate and give money and work for the causes that they care about in education, in justice, in charity, and so on. So when societies have all these possibilities of doing that, then they're a rich civil society. Well, one of the keys to a thriving civil society is religious freedom. Where did many of our educational movements come from? Our charitable movements, our movements for reform and justice, faith-based. And you can see governments making a great mistake today. We want to remove the tax privileges from religion. Or they're saying, if you want to do work in Africa as an NGO, you've got to go along with the new ideas of the sexual revolution and support lesbians and gays and so on. Well, do you see what they're doing? Since most of the organizations in the world are faith-based, when they're restricting religious freedom, they're killing the goose that lays the golden egg. And when the faith-based movements are not able to do it, but we still have the huge social problems that someone must answer, the government will have to do it. So the government gets bigger, but the government's already running out of money. And so you can see the folly of many of our government policies. They're killing the goose that lays the golden egg because they forget that religious freedom is one of the keys to civil society. The last reason, religious freedom is the source of social harmony. I grew up in China. I go back every year or two to China, and many times I've heard Chinese people, scholars and others, they say, well, China is a harmonious society. You in the West are chaotic. Harmony. And I say to them, come on, that's no big deal. In China, you have incredible diversity, and you have considerable harmony. But that's no big deal, because you don't have the third thing that matters, liberty. The challenge in the modern world is to have diversity with liberty and still achieve social harmony. America's done it best most of the time, not doing very well today, but done it best most of the time. But you can see in history, it's countries that know what it is to give religious freedom for everybody and figure out what that means, that truly can achieve diversity and harmony and still have a thriving degree of religious freedom. So, as I said, this is not a matter of the gospel, but it is a matter of human justice. It is a matter of freedom for us and for everybody. We have the freedom to enter the public square, take, say, preaching. If the Muslims have their way, or the liberals have their way, they'll override human rights. Article 18 guarantees the ability to convert. The Muslims win, the liberals win, we'll have no proselytism. In other words, evangelism will be ruled out, as it is in many countries. So the gospel has huge stakes in this, as well as the humanity and freedom of our future. And my longing is that Christians, especially you who are journalists, would really be in the forefront of constructive ways of arguing for these things, not only for us, but for the sake of humankind in the future.